Hi, very glad to see you on the channel. Before you start listening to the story, write in the comments whether you like the voice on the video. Summer in Tampa always had a way of pressing down on you. The heat was relentless, thick in the air, settling into the pavement, and hanging in the space between conversations. The neighborhood was alive with the usual sounds: lawnmowers humming, kids splashing in backyard pools, the occasional burst of laughter from a porch where cold drinks were being passed around. Everyone was talking about the 4th of July block party. It was a tradition on our street. Tables lined with barbecue trays, coolers packed with beer and soda, fireworks waiting in someone's garage. The kind of thing that made a neighborhood feel like a community. While you're here, leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I'd love to know. I should have been looking forward to it. Instead, I was watching my wife lie to me. Julia had always been good at balancing things: her job, her friendships, our marriage. But lately, something had shifted. She had been coming home late, brushing it off with quick excuses. Work ran over. Had to help out a friend. Lost track of time. The first few times I had let it slide. Everyone gets busy, but patterns form when you pay attention. She had started dressing nicer on the days she worked late. Clothes she did not usually wear to the office. Perfume that was saved for special occasions. Her phone, once casually left on the counter, was always in her hand or face down on the table. When I asked questions, she smiled like I was being ridiculous. When I pushed, she pushed back. "Ethan, not everything is some big secret," she had said last week, shaking her head as she walked past me. Maybe not, but some things were. The neighborhood meeting for the block party was held at the Lennox's house. They had the biggest backyard, with a deck that stretched wide enough to fit most of the usual crowd. When I showed up, half the street was already there, drinks in hand, tossing around ideas for decorations and food stations. Julia was not with me. She had another late night. I grabbed a beer for the cooler and leaned against the railing, watching the scene unfold. People talked about fireworks, who would be manning the grill, whether or not last year's cornhole tournament should be brought back. Casual, easy conversation. The kind I used to enjoy. I took a sip of my drink just as Derek Patterson, one of my neighbors, clapped a hand on my shoulder. "Ethan, you handling the music setup this year?" I nodded. "Yeah, I'll take care of it." Derek grinned. "Good. Last year's playlist was solid. Just keep my wife from requesting 80s ballads all night." A few of the guys nearby laughed. That was when Lisa Carmichael spoke up. She was one of those people who always had something to say, whether she should or not. "Julia coming later?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "She's working late," I said, keeping my voice even. Lisa made a small sound, something close to a laugh. "She has been putting in a lot of overtime." "Huh?" Ich glänzte her. "What do you mean?" "Oh, nothing," she said quickly, too quickly. "Just that I saw her the other night. Thought maybe she had wrapped up work early." The conversation around us kept going, but my focus was locked in now. "What did you see her?" Lisa hesitated, realizing she had walked into something. She glanced around, then took a slow sip of her drink. "By the marina." I kept my expression neutral. "When?" "Tuesday night. Around 9. Julia had told me she was stuck in a late meeting that night." Lisa gave a small shrug. "Could have been nothing. She was getting into a car." I leaned slightly forward. "What car?" She paused, debating whether she should keep talking. Then she sighed. "Black BMW. Looked familiar, but I couldn't place it. A black BMW. Not her car. Not a co-worker's that I knew of." The conversation moved on, but I stayed quiet, my mind shifting gears. Julia had lied to me. That part was clear. The question was why. And more importantly, who was she with? She came home that night at 10:30. I was in the garage organizing tools that did not need organizing. Her car pulled in, headlights washing over the driveway before shutting off. I heard the door open, the click of her heels against the pavement. She stepped inside, setting her purse on the kitchen counter. I waited a few seconds before following. She looked up when I walked in, her smile automatic. "Hey, didn't know you'd still be up." I leaned against the doorframe. "Lisa saw you by the marina the other night." It was not a question. Julia blinked, just for a second. Then she let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "Lisa needs a hobby. She said she saw you getting into a car." She waved a hand dismissively. "A co-worker gave me a ride." Which co-worker? Her smile thinned slightly. Does it matter? I held her gaze. Yeah, it does. She exhaled, shaking her head again. You're reading into things, Ethan. Maybe, but maybe not. She grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge, brushing past me as if that was the end of the conversation. It was not. I let her think she had walked away from it. Let her believe I would let it go. Because now I had my own plan. She was hiding something. I just had to figure out what. The next morning, the block looked the same as always. Quiet, suburban, nothing out of place. Sprinklers hissed over neatly trimmed lawns. Neighbors waved as they backed their cars out of driveways, and the smell of fresh coffee drifted from porches where retirees read the morning news. But the conversations had changed. People were talking. Not openly, not in any way that would draw too much attention, but I could see it in the way they leaned in when they spoke, the way their eyes shifted toward me when they thought I wasn't looking. Something was being said, and I needed to know what. Derek owned a landscaping company, which meant he knew everything about everyone. He spent his days driving from house to house, overhearing conversations, watching patterns. If anyone had information, it would be him. I found him unloading mulch from his truck later that afternoon. Busy week, I asked, keeping my voice casual. He wiped his hands on his jeans. Always is this time of year. I nodded, waited a beat, then threw out the line. Seems like people have been talking more than usual. Derek gave a short laugh, shaking his head. That's what happens when things get messy. I let the words sit between us before responding. Messy how? He glanced at me, measuring. Then he exhaled. I wasn't going to say anything, but people have seen Julia's car at Tony Carter's place. More than once. I didn't react. Late at night, he added. Not exactly business hours. Tony Carter. It made sense. Tony had lived in the neighborhood for years. He was the guy who always had the best cookouts, the biggest television for football season, the newest car parked in his driveway. He was also the guy who never settled down. His house was the go-to spot for late-night drinks, poolside parties, and conversations that stretched until sunrise. And now my wife was spending time there. I gave Derek a slow nod. Appreciate it. He hesitated, then said, You sure you're good? I met his gaze. I will be. Then I walked away. I waited 3 days before doing anything. Julia's schedule had been predictable lately. Home late, vague excuses, quick kisses on the cheek that meant nothing. That night, I told her I had a long shift at the store. Left like usual. Drove to a gas station on the other side of town, parked, and waited. At 8:30, she texted, Hope your night isn't too long. See you later. I did not respond. Instead, I drove back toward our neighborhood, keeping my lights off as I turned onto the street before Tony's house. His place sat on the corner, a perfect view of the backyard from the side street. The pool lights glowed, casting long shadows across the patio. Music played from an outdoor speaker, soft, easy, like the kind you hear in a hotel lounge. Julia was there. She sat close to Tony, legs crossed, body angled toward him in a way that did not leave room for misinterpretation. He leaned in, whispering something. She laughed, her fingers brushing against his arm. It was not a business meeting. I stayed long enough to be sure, long enough to memorize every detail, every shift in body language, every moment that confirmed exactly what I already knew. Then I pulled away, driving slow, making no sound. I had no interest in making a scene. That would come later. For now, I had everything I needed. I did not go home right away. Instead, I drove. Not toward anything in particular, just away from what I had seen. I passed through quiet streets, empty parking lots, the occasional fast food place still buzzing with late-night orders. The radio stayed off. I was not in the mood for music. Julia and Tony. I had seen enough to know the truth. But knowing was not enough. I needed proof. Not just for myself, but for what came next. The next morning, Julia moved through the house like nothing had changed. She kissed me on the cheek before heading out, her perfume lingering in the space she left behind. I waited a few minutes after she pulled out of the driveway before stepping into the office. She was careful with her phone, but her laptop? Less so. I powered it on, entered the passcode I had known for years, and started looking. Emails, calendar invites, messages. She had been good at covering her tracks. No obvious names, no suspicious emails. But she was not perfect. One message stood out. A reminder for a dinner reservation. 8 p.m. Oceanfront Grill. Table for two. She had never mentioned it to me. A business meeting? No. Not with the dress she had worn last night. Not with the way she had leaned into Tony's touch. I shut the laptop and exhaled slowly. This was not just an affair. It was a routine, a pattern she had been perfecting. She had been doing this for a while. Later that day, I stopped by the local cafe. Not for coffee, but for something else. Stacy Daniels sat near the window, scrolling through her phone, a half-finished iced latte on the table. She was always around, at every neighborhood event, every gathering. The kind of person who knew what was happening before most people did. She looked up as I approached. Ethan. Stacy. I pulled out a chair, lowering myself into it. She studied me for a second, as if deciding how much to say. Then she folded her hands together. Something is going on? Not a question. I nodded once. She hesitated, then said, I saw Julia with Tony last week. I leaned back slightly. Where? Grocery store parking lot. She got into his car. I did not think much of it at the time, but she trailed off, tapping her fingers against her cup. People have been talking. So I have heard. She sighed. Ethan, I do not like gossip, but I have known Julia a long time. This is not like her. I said nothing, because she was wrong. This was exactly like her. The version of Julia I had been seeing, the one slipping away, making excuses, staying out late, this was who she really was. The question now was, how much more was she hiding? And how far was I willing to go to find out? Kayla Carter had been quiet lately. Too quiet. Tony's wife was not the kind of woman to fade into the background. She had a presence, sharp, observant, the type of person who caught details others missed. But over the past few weeks, she had barely been seen. She skipped the usual morning runs through the neighborhood, stopped showing up to the afternoon pool gatherings. Even at the last block party meeting, she had kept to herself, barely speaking, barely reacting. She knew something, and I needed to find out what. I found her at the cafe the next morning. She sat near the back, stirring a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Her sunglasses stayed on, even indoors. I pulled out a chair and sat across from her. She did not look up right away. Then, finally, she spoke. Ethan. Kayla. She tapped the spoon against the rim of her cup, a slow, deliberate rhythm. Did not expect to see you here. I think you did. A small exhale. Not quite a laugh. Not quite an agreement. She adjusted the sunglasses, pushing them to the top of her head. Her eyes were tired, but her expression was controlled. People have been talking, I said. About Tony. About Julia. Her jaw tightened. She did not deny it. That was all I needed. For the next hour, we talked. Not about the small things. Not about the usual pleasantries people leaned on to avoid the truth. We talked about them. About the way Tony had started coming home late, smelling like perfume that was not hers. About the way Julia had been lying so easily, as if she had practiced every excuse beforehand. About the way both of them had been slipping out of their marriages in plain sight, assuming no one would notice. Kayla's hands curled around her cup. They think they have control, she said finally. I nodded. They do not. Her lips parted slightly, as if she was about to say something else, but then she stopped. I leaned in. What do you want, Kayla? A pause. Then, quietly, revenge. The plan came together faster than I expected. It did not take much convincing. Kayla was not weak. She was not hesitant. She had spent weeks, maybe months, watching her husband betray her, and now she was done pretending. If Julia and Tony wanted to lie, sneak around, ruin their marriages without consequence, then we would show them what betrayal really felt like. It was not about love. It was not even about attraction. It was about taking back control. Kayla met my gaze across the table. When I checked the time, then I smiled. Tonight, Stacy stood on my porch, arms crossed, weight shifted slightly to one side like she was bracing herself for whatever came next. I know, she said again. I let the words settle, watching her closely. Know what? She exhaled sharply. Julia, Tony, the affair. All of it. No hesitation. No vising. Just a statement of fact. I leaned against the railing. How long have you known? Her fingers tapped against her elbow, a nervous habit. A while. She hesitated. I saw the messages, Ethan, on Julia's phone. That got my attention. She glanced around, lowering her voice. A few weeks ago, we had a girls' night at Lisa's. Julia was acting weird, laughing too much, checking her phone every few minutes, holding on to it like it was made of gold. At one point, she got up to grab another drink and left it sitting on the couch. Stacy's lips pressed together. I should have left it alone, but something told me to look. I said nothing, waiting. She rubbed the back of her neck. There were messages from a number with no name, but I recognized the way he talked, the way she responded. Tony, I said flatly. She nodded. He was telling her how much he missed her, how he couldn't wait to see her again. She was saying things back, Ethan. Things no wife should be saying to another man. I ran my thumb over the edge of the railing, processing. You confronted her? No. Stacy let out a bitter laugh. I put the phone down and pretended I never saw it. I told myself it wasn't my business, that if you found out, it would happen on its own. Her jaw tightened. But I can't do that anymore. I studied her. Why now? She met my gaze, something sharp in her expression. Because I see what she's doing to you. The way she walks around like she's untouchable, like you won't figure it out. She doesn't deserve to get away with it. That was the first honest thing I had heard from anyone in weeks. We sat on the porch, away from listening ears, and laid everything out. Stacy told me what she had pieced together, Julia's excuses, the time she worked late, the moments that had not added up. She had been watching, and so had I. Between the two of us, the picture was clear. Julia and Tony had created schedule, a pattern. Wednesdays, Julia claimed to have meetings after work. She never came home before 10. Fridays, Tony stayed out late, using vague business deals as his cover. Those were their nights, their time. It made things easier, because now Kayla and I had a window of opportunity. Stacy leaned forward, lowering her voice. What are you planning to do? I took a slow breath, measuring my words. What would you do? She hesitated. Honestly, I nodded. Her smile was thin, humorless. I would make them regret it. I held her gaze. That is exactly what I intend to do. For the first time, she did not look surprised. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Here. I took it, unfolding it slowly. It was a handwritten note. Friday. Julia's at the marina at 7. Tony picked her up by 8. I glanced up. Stacy's expression was unreadable. If you're going to do something, that is your time. I tapped the paper against my knee. Why help me, Stacy? She shrugged. Because some people deserve what is coming to them. She stood, giving me one last look before stepping off the porch. Good luck, Ethan, she said over her shoulder. She did not need to say anything else. That night, I called Kayla. We move Friday, I told her. A pause. Then, quietly, I will be ready. She did not ask for details. She already knew. Julia and Tony had spent months controlling the game. Now it was our turn. And when we made our move, they would never see it coming. Friday came faster than expected. Julia left at 6:30, a rushed kiss on my cheek, a vague excuse about running late. She grabbed her bag, checked her phone twice, then disappeared out the door. She did not ask where I was going, because she thought she already knew. By 7, I was in my truck, pulling onto the highway, heading toward the coast. Kayla was waiting when I arrived. The beachfront bed and breakfast was small, tucked away just enough to feel private, but still visible to the kind of people who like to talk. A place where someone was always watching, where a casual sighting could turn into a full-fledged rumor by morning. Perfect. Kayla stood near the balcony, leaning on the railing, staring out at the ocean. She had changed, loose waves in her dark hair, a fitted dress that looked effortless but was anything but. She turned when she heard me step inside. You ready? She asked. I nodded. Let's make them sweat. She smiled, slow and knowing. Then she picked up her phone. The first photo was simple. A table for two, wine glasses filled, candlelight flickering. The caption was vague, a night well-deserved. It did not take long. The first like, then another, then a comment. By the time Kayla posted the second picture, just her hand resting on the edge of her drink, people were already talking. I leaned back in my chair, watching the screen light up. Give it 10 minutes. Kayla smirked. 5. She was right. Stacy's phone rang just after 9. She glanced at the screen, raising an eyebrow before answering. Julia, where is he? Stacy blinked. Who? Julia's voice was tight. Ethan. Someone said they saw him with someone. Stacy leaned back against her couch, twirling the stem of her wine glass between her fingers. Did they? Lisa said she saw a picture. A fancy dinner. 2 glasses. That is not something Ethan usually does. Stacy hummed. Maybe he needed a break. Julia exhaled sharply. Stace, do not do this. Just tell me if you know where he is. Stacy let the silence stretch. Then she laughed softly. You sound nervous. Julia hesitated. I am not. Really? More silence. Then quieter. I just need to know if I should be worried. Stacy swirled her wine. I guess that depends. Julia's breath caught. On what? Stacy smiled. What you been up to? The call ended without another word. She set her phone down, shaking her head. Julia was unraveling. And this was just the beginning. Kayla refreshed the post again, watching the views climb. She has seen it by now, she said. I nodded, stretching out of my chair. Good. Kayla turned to me, something amused in her expression. Think she's panicking? I picked up my drink, taking a slow sip. She should be. The 4th of July had always been a big deal in our neighborhood. People went all out. Flags on every porch, coolers stocked with beer, tables covered in barbecue trays. Kids ran through sprinklers. The smell of grilled burgers drifted through the air, and the whole street buzzed with anticipation for the fireworks display later that night. But this year, something else was in the air. Something heavier. Because today was not just about fireworks. Today was about the fallout. The moment I stepped onto the street with Kayla, I felt the shift. People were watching, pretending not to, but failing. Conversations dropped to hushed murmurs. Heads turned. A few neighbors exchanged glances, their eyes darting between us and the 2 people who had yet to see us, Julia and Tony. Kayla leaned in slightly. They are already on edge. I smirked. Good. We walked at an easy pace, not rushing, not sneaking. Kayla adjusted her sunglasses, casually scanning the crowd, as if she was just another guest at another party. But she was not, and neither was I. Julia arrived 20 minutes later. She wore her usual mask, smiling, chatting, laughing in the right places, but her eyes kept moving. She was looking for something, or someone. I watched from a distance as she accepted a drink from Lisa, nodded along to a conversation she was not really listening to. Then she saw me. Her whole body tensed, her grip tightening around the plastic cup in her hand. Her eyes flicked to Kayla, standing close, too close. And then the mask cracked. Tony arrived separately, stepping onto the street like he owned it. He clapped Derek on the back, grinned at a few guys near the grill, played his part. But it was forced. His movements too sharp, his smiles too tight. It did not take him long to notice Kayla. And the second he did, his whole expression darkened. Julia reached me first. She moved fast, weaving through the crowd, her voice sharp and low. What is this? I grabbed a drink from the refreshment table, popped the cap, and took a slow sip. What is what? Her eyes flashed. You know what? I leaned against the table. You seem nervous. Julia exhaled, forcing a laugh, but there was no humor in it. You disappear for a night, and suddenly show up with her? What are you doing, Ethan? I took another sip, watching her, not answering, letting her squirm. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. If you're trying to make me jealous, this is pathetic. I smiled. Who said I was trying anything? Her breath hitched, just for a second, just enough to show that she was unraveling. She knew. She just did not know how much I knew. Across the yard, Tony grabbed Kayla's arm. What the hell are you doing? His voice was low, furious. Kayla tilted her head, lips curving in amusement, enjoying the party. Tony's grip tightened. Do not play games with me. Kayla arched a brow. Why not? You have been playing plenty yourself. Tony's jaw clenched. This is not funny. She leaned in, voice like silk. No, Tony. It is hilarious. Nearby, Stacy sipped her drink, watching. Waiting. Ready. The tension crackled. People pretended to focus on their conversations, but all eyes were on us now. Julia's breath came short, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. Tell me what this is, Ethan. Right now. I glanced over at Tony and Kayla at the way Tony's hands curled into fists, at the way Kayla held her ground, unbothered. Then I looked back at Julia, smirked, and said, "Fireworks are starting early this year." The street had gone quiet. Music still played from the speakers, kids still ran with sparklers in hand. But the real show was unfolding right here, between four people standing in the center of the party. Julia's breathing was uneven. Tony's hands were clenched. Everyone else, watching, waiting. Kayla crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly. "You look confused, Tony." Tony's jaw tightened. "You think this is funny?" I exhaled a slow breath, glancing between them. "You know what? It is funny." Julia snapped her attention back to me. "What is that supposed to mean?" I took my time, rolling my shoulders back, making sure every word landed exactly the way I wanted. "It means we spent the weekend together," I said, nodding toward Kayla. "A beachfront. Nice place. You should check it out sometime." Julia's eyes widened. Tony's nostrils flared. Kayla smirked. "Oh, wait. You have been there before, haven't you?" The silence that followed was louder than anything else at the party. Lisa, standing a few feet away, actually gasped. Derek took a slow sip of his drink, eyebrows raised. Julia shook her head, stepping forward. She swallowed. "You did this to get back at me?" Kayla's eyes flicked to Tony. "We just wanted you to see how it feels to be blindsided." Tony's face darkened. "You are out of your mind." Kayla arched a brow. Says the man who has been sneaking around with another woman for months. Julia's fingers curled around her plastic cup, knuckles going white. "You are lying." I laughed, low, amused. Then I pulled my phone from my pocket, scrolled, turned the screen toward her. Her own messages stared back at her. Messages pulled from a source she never expected to turn on her. "Stacy." Julia's throat bobbed. "Where did you get that?" Stacy stepped forward, casual, unbothered. "From you." Julia's face drained of color. "You went through my phone?" "Think of it as correcting a mistake," Stacy said, pulling a folded paper from her bag. "In case you need a hard copy." She extended it toward Julia, who did not take it. So she handed it to Lisa instead. Lisa, who had spent years hanging onto every scandal, every piece of gossip, every secret in this town. Lisa, who would make sure everyone knew exactly what Julia had been doing. Julia's breath came short. "You had no right." Stacy shrugged. "Neither did you." Tony's glare burned into Kayla. "You think this makes you better than me?" Kayla laughed. "Oh, Tony, I have always been better than you." Tony's fists clenched. "You're pathetic." Kayla smiled. "No, you are. And now, the whole neighborhood knows it." A slow ripple spread through the crowd. The whispers turned into murmurs. The murmurs turned into full conversations. Julia and Tony were out of excuses, out of lies. The town had seen everything they needed to see. And then, boom, the first firework exploded overhead. Bright colors flashed against the dark sky, loud and commanding, stealing the attention of the crowd for just a moment. I turned back to Julia, taking in the way her shoulders had slumped, the way her entire world had just collapsed in on itself. She looked at me like she wanted to say something, like she needed to say something. I let her sit in it. Then I smiled and walked away. Kayla followed, her head held high. And for the first time in weeks, I breathed easily. Because this game was over. The fireworks had started, but nobody was watching them. The crowd had gathered around, faces flickering in the glow of red, white, and blue bursts overhead. Laughter and cheers filled the night air. But within our circle, the energy was different. Julia stood frozen. The printed messages Stacy had handed her clenched in her grip. Tony's jaw was tight, his fists curled at his sides. Neither of them spoke. Because there was nothing left to say, I took a slow step closer, letting the moment stretch. "We just wanted you to see how it feels," I said evenly. "To be blindsided." Julia blinked, her lips parting like she wanted to argue. But the words failed her. Kayla tilted her head, watching Tony. "Not so fun when you're the ones being played, is it?" Tony exhaled through his nose, nostrils flaring. "This is childish." Kayla laughed, low and sharp. "What was childish, Tony? The part where you snuck around behind my back? Or the part where you thought you would never get caught?" He shot her a glare, but she did not waver. She was standing taller now, stronger. Tony had spent years thinking he owned every situation, that he was the one pulling the strings. Not anymore. Julia's hands trembled as she unfolded the papers again, rereading her own words. The messages were short but damning. Wish you were here instead of him. Last night was amazing. Same time next week? Ethan has no idea. It is almost too easy. I watched her absorb every word. Watched her eyes dart over them, like she could somehow change what was written. She looked at me, voice barely above a whisper. Where did you get this? Stacy stepped forward, slow and deliberate. From you. Julia turned, confused. Stacy gave a small shrug, her tone casual. You left your phone unlocked during girls' night. I saw everything. She sighed. And trust me, Julia, I really tried to ignore it. But I just could not stand by and watch you do this to Ethan. Julia's face went pale. You were supposed to be my friend, she said, voice unsteady. Stacy smiled. No, Julia, I was your friend. You just were never mine. The crowd murmured, people whispering to each other, the truth of the situation sinking in. Lisa, who had taken the papers from Stacy earlier, cleared her throat. This is a lot. Julia turned sharply. You do not need to read that. Lisa arched a brow. Too late. She waved the pages. I think the whole town is about to know. Julia's breath hitched. The perfect image she had spent years curating? Gone. And there was no way to fix it. Tony rolled his shoulders back, trying to regain control. All right, so he screwed up. But this? He gestured at me and Kayla. This is just as bad. I met his gaze without flinching. No, Tony. This was necessary. Julia swallowed hard. Ethan, I shook my head. Do not. There is nothing you can say that will change this. Another firework exploded overhead, casting shifting colors across Julia's face. She looked smaller now, stripped of the confidence she had always worn so easily. Kayla stepped closer to me, a slow smile pulling at her lips. Come on, she said, voice light, almost amused. Let's enjoy the fireworks. I smirked, giving one last glance at Julia and Tony. Then I turned, walking away with Kayla beside me. As we left them standing there, exposed, humiliated, defeated, Stacy let out a soft chuckle. Lisa, still clutching the evidence, muttered under her breath. Best 4th of July ever. And above us, fireworks continued to crack open the night. The fireworks ended, but the real show was just beginning. As the final bursts of red and gold faded into the night, the crowd started to break apart, neighbors gathering in small clusters, voices hushed but urgent. Everyone had something to say. Lisa whispered to Derek near the grill, shaking her head with exaggerated disbelief. A few of the older couples exchanged knowing glances, the kind that said they had seen scandals before but never one this public. Phones buzzed. Messages were sent. By morning, the entire neighborhood would know every detail. Julia and Tony had spent months thinking they were untouchable. Now, they had nowhere to hide. They stood near the refreshment table, silent. Tony's usual arrogance had drained from his face. His arms were crossed, his jaw clenched, eyes darting toward the people around him. He could hear them talking. He knew exactly what they were saying. Julia, standing just inches away, looked even worse. Her shoulders were rigid, fingers still gripping the now crumpled papers Stacy had given her. She wasn't reading them anymore. She didn't need to. She had already lost. Someone laughed, short, sharp, just loud enough to make her flinch. She turned to Tony, her voice barely above a whisper. Say something. Tony exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. What do you want me to say? She swallowed hard. We have to fix this. His gaze snapped to her. Fix it? His voice was quiet but sharp. Julia, this is not something we fix. We got caught. That is it. She opened her mouth, then shut it again. There was nothing left to say. Tony glanced at the people still watching them. Some pretended to look elsewhere, but a few didn't bother hiding their amusement. With a frustrated shake of his head, he turned on his heel and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Julia watched him go, her breath coming short, her world crumbling around her. Lisa took a slow sip of her drink and muttered just loud enough for Julia to hear. Well, that didn't last long. Julia's entire body stiffened. Then, without another word, She turned and stormed off into the night. The whispers followed her all the way home. I stood near the edge of the street, watching it all unfold. Kayla joined me, her expression unreadable. Think they will ever recover from that? I shrugged. Not my problem. She smirked, glancing up at the sky, where smoke from the fireworks still lingered. That was satisfying. I turned to look at her. Yeah, it was. Stacy appeared a moment later, stepping up beside us. So, she said, tilting her head, are you two officially a thing now, or was that just the most dramatic revenge plot this neighborhood has ever seen? Kayla laughed, shaking her head. Who knows? Stacy grinned. Either way, I am impressed. She turned to me, her expression more serious. You okay? I met her gaze. Better than I have been in a long time. She studied me for a second, then nodded. Good. Then, with a satisfied smile, she walked off, disappearing into the fading crowd. Kayla and I stood in silence for a while, watching as the party slowly dissolved. She exhaled, stretching her arms above her head. Well, I guess this is the part where I go home and figure out what comes next. I nodded. Same here. She turned to face me fully, a curious glint in her eye. You ever think about what is next, Ethan? I smirked. Every day, a slow smile spread across her lips. Good. She stepped back, giving me one last lingering glance before heading down the street. I watched her go, the night settling around me, the echoes of laughter and conversation fading into the distance. Julia and Tony had thought they were in control. Now, they were just another cautionary tale. And as for me, for the first time in a long time, I had the upper hand. Thank you for listening to the end. I hope you enjoyed it very much. Don't forget to give a like, and tell us in the comments what you would do in such a situation.